Those who give up essential liberty to obtain temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. So goes the famous quote by Benjamin Franklin, declaring that freedom is not a luxury, but a necessity for a good life. This encapsulates most modern political thinking, which makes freedom the ultimate goal. Both the mainstream left and right seek to improve living standards, which they define in terms of freedom. Even in ostensible ethical disagreements, for example abortion, what's ethical is defined by what grants more freedom. It's so ubiquitous in politics that one might begin to wonder whether it's more of a platitude than an actual ideal. Is that the case? That is what I intend to explore in this video. But before we can answer that question, we must first ask what freedom even is. Countless definitions have been given over the centuries by numerous different thinkers, but these all conflict wildly with each other, and in any case, this won't get us any closer to answering our question. Instead, we will use freedom in the same way most people do. This undefined, unspecified thing, which is the existential goal for both the individual and society at large. Freedom, in this sense, is pretty straightforward. The ability to live as you want, and the right to determine the course of your own life. Like I said, this isn't a trivial choosing an ice cream flavor type freedom. It's being allowed to succeed, to be master over your own property and affairs, not to be decided by anyone but yourself. Freedom is, in short, the capacity for self-determination, to be your own center of gravity, to be independent, and to be as unconditioned as possible. But is it really possible to be free in the sense of being completely unconditioned? Is it possible to live in my own way, independently and exclusively for my own sake? Even the greatest advocates of freedom might not say so, as we cannot be free from God or maybe from the law, and we may in fact have to sacrifice some smaller freedoms for the sake of greater freedoms. Murder being illegal removes one's freedom to murder, but this also creates a security of life in society, which in turn allows for greater freedom for everyone. The idea of sacrificing certain freedoms for greater social good is usually referred to as a social contract. The idea is probably as old as society itself, but the term was first used by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century. Hobbes lived in England during the English Civil War, which was fought between royal absolutists and parliamentarians. His social contract theory posited that rebelling against absolute royal power was wrong, since the populace had already consented to its rule. So how did he figure this? Hobbes wanted to figure out how the state emerged and what society would be like without it, in a so-called state of nature. To determine this, he observed his human contemporaries acting in society, and worked his way backward, and concluded that life in such a state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. People had private property they wanted to defend and increase, and an aversion to looking weak in front of others. So people were greedy and prideful, traits which aren't exactly conducive to peaceful conduct. Additionally, in the absence of a state, there's nothing to stop man from acting on those desires, so, in effect, everyone has a right to everything, provided they have the strength to take it. People would thus live isolated from one another, in a constant state of war of all against all. Obviously, that situation is hardly desirable, as security and prosperity are impossible. Therefore, Hobbes thought that people would seek a remedy for this situation, and this would come in the form of a contract where everyone would renounce some freedoms in order to facilitate cooperation. He also thought that the society would delegate the contract's enforcement to a separate organization with capacity for violence so great that it would deter any attempt to disturb the peace by dint of its terrifying appearance. A leviathan that would keep all men in awe. People sacrificed their freedom in exchange for their life. While this may appear as the most illiberal and totalitarian idea imaginable, Hobbes is sometimes regarded as the first liberal for his formulation of the social contract, because it reinvented the concept of legitimate rule from divine right to something purely utilitarian. Many liberals and libertarians echo this sentiment today, that the state might on some level be evil, but it's still necessary, because without it there would necessarily be chaos, and so some freedoms must be surrendered to ensure security and other greater freedoms. But social contract theory didn't end with Hobbes. Another major contributor to the theory was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Although he was a social contract theorist, he had antithetical beliefs to those of Hobbes, and criticized him heavily. His main critique was against Hobbes' assumption that humans are innately greedy and prideful. Of course, one could defer to conceptions of human nature. If one reviews history, there indeed seems to be a tendency for warlike and aggressive behavior. But let's actually stop and think about that. If humans live alone in nature, without a society around them, why would they be greedy? People would hunt and take from nature in complete solitude, perhaps without ever interacting with each other. The abundance of nature would mean that there is no need to compete with others for resources, so how could we be greedy? And how can they be motivated to protect their private property if private property doesn't exist? And if we live in solitude, how can you retaliate against an act of violence for the sake of not looking weak if there's no one to judge you as weak? In short, Hobbes assumed the behavior of his contemporaries in society was representative of human nature, but Rousseau correctly pointed out that their behavior required the state and society to already exist, and thus could not have existed without them. Rousseau, contra Hobbes, thought that people living alone outside of society would be timid and care only for themselves. There might be isolated incidents of violence or theft, but you'd have no incentive to retaliate. If you're weak and get your things stolen, you just run off and find more elsewhere. Of course, Rousseau's conception of the state of nature is also wrong. Modern anthropology tells us that humans lived communally in tribes, with a notion of territory, just as some animals do. But even so, he delivered a strong refutation of Hobbes's ideas. Where Hobbes thought that the state was shaped by human behavior, Rousseau concluded human behavior was shaped by the state. But how does the state connect to our ideas of freedom? Here is the critical point. Modern liberal states see themselves not only as peacekeepers, but also as the guarantors of freedom. The law, for example, doesn't just permit or prohibit, restrict freedom or promote it. It also ensures the freedom of each citizen through rights. The liberal state consists of several institutions which are perceived as the guardians of liberty. But just as these institutions theoretically grant us freedom, they also, as Rousseau pointed out, shape our behaviors and lifestyles in very particular ways. In my previous video on liberalism, I challenged the idea that liberal societies and their freedoms give good outcomes, or that they necessarily increase happiness, and suggested that a traditional lifestyle, despite its illiberality, may in many regards be more desirable. One recurring response to this idea was that even if a liberal lifestyle isn't desirable, a liberal society at least gives you the freedom to live an illiberal life if you choose to, unlike an illiberal society which wouldn't permit a liberal lifestyle. But in light of our previous point, can this really be said? Does a liberal society grant you that freedom, or does it shape the way we live just as much as an illiberal society? In other words, are we truly free to live as we desire, or are we only free to live a liberal lifestyle? Let's again really evaluate the matter. Can one really lead a traditional life in a liberal society? Let's take a traditional clan family structure, one where marriage, education, and work is decided for the good of the whole family rather than being chosen by the individual members. A liberal society which guarantees individual rights and choice would render such a thing impossible. Or suppose a traditional religious structure that's meant to encompass the entire community and thereby provide a definite cohesion and sense of unity. Here too, a liberal, secular society must intervene, as it can't grant religion a public presence, and faith becomes atomized to individual citizens. You could also imagine a group who adheres to a traditional agricultural lifestyle and does not use money. Such a group existing in a liberal society is almost inconceivable. Of course, money's status isn't formally codified, but all laws pertaining to economics assume its supremacy. One idea present throughout all these examples is the mutual interdependence of individuals within a society, where decisions made by one member naturally affect the whole. The idea that people can live independently from each other, and that their actions impact nobody but themselves, is somewhat of a liberal illusion. This can be seen even in the current liberal lifestyles many lead. While it seems from the outside as though the consequences of an individual's actions are merely confined to themselves, they do affect the people around them, even if it isn't always as dramatic or direct. We don't choose to live liberal lifestyles, nor do we seek out or question alternatives. But even if we did, the legal relations between individuals quickly stifle our efforts. Does the individual's freedom of choice really matter then? Or is it merely the illusion of choice, offered in the golden handcuffs of the liberal lifestyle? Let us also return to our point about freedom as an existential goal, and the initial quote about how only a free life is worth living. The point is this: these freedoms must be established in the law and constitution. This is why we have freedom of expression, association, religion, and so on. But these freedoms are not only dependent on, but also shaped by the state and its institutions, which are modern creations. For example, freedom of expression is only necessary if one presumes that speech is politically relevant. Freedom of association presumes a democratic system of government where there exists distinct social groups that would benefit from political influence. Freedom of religion presumes a society in which there are several distinct religions coexisting, and that society is divided into religious and secular spheres, neither of which have been the case for most of history. Like, how could freedom of religion exist in a pre-secular society with only one religion? These freedoms only make sense within our modern, purely contractual conception of the state, which exists as a service to the public. In a pre-modern society that has none of these notions, where leadership was grounded either in the people themselves or in a metaphysical concept, these quote-unquote freedoms are completely incomprehensible. But the state cannot serve the people's needs as such, because the people's needs are affected, and to some extent conditioned, by the state. To argue that these freedoms have existed in all times, beyond our modern liberal state, and that equivalents to the freedoms of expression, association, or religion existed in all historical societies, and are thus universal and non-contingent on the liberal state, would be profoundly wrong and frankly stupid. But that fact has never stopped Francis Fukuyama, who is frequently wrong and stupid, and also argues this exact point. In his Political Order series, Fukuyama reduces the modern state to simply a hierarchical organization capable of creating order through violence, and then compares them to other such organizations throughout history. By using such a reductive definition, Fukuyama can freely assert that the states today, states in the 19th century, as well as medieval kingdoms and classical city-states, and so on, are all completely equivalent to one another. This equivocation completely overlooks the many tangible differences between these different systems, and also permits the state to be essentialized as something universal, necessary, and unquestionable. Now, I said earlier that our needs and desires are at least partially conditioned by the state. If this is the case, then some questions must be raised. Can our desires be expressions of that existential freedom that Benjamin Franklin spoke of, or merely a result of our modern circumstances? Since freedoms are likewise dependent on circumstances and change with those circumstances, can we really speak of their universality or of one set of freedoms being equivalent to another? And if not, does this jeopardize the idea of freedom being an existential goal or one coherent good? Finally, if there indeed isn't one coherent freedom, then which one is desirable? We think of ourselves as free, but are we really? Some might suggest these points are unrealistic or irrelevant. Does it matter that we're not free from some of the things I've mentioned here? Perhaps not. But considering our modern attitude, which sets freedom as the highest ideal, can we really dismiss those things so easily? I don't think so. Modern society isn't really free as such, except for the forced freedom of the liberal lifestyle. For many, this is sufficient and indeed desirable. But to admit that takes us only farther from the truly free life, in favor of a life in the confines of the liberal social paradigm. Paradoxically, from here it becomes possible to justify the enforcement of the liberal life onto others, which is a very illiberal idea. The bottom line here is that freedom is an unclear and frequently contradictory word. But does that mean we shouldn't seek it, or even curtail it? Of course not. I'm not suggesting that freedom is bad, or that we ought to submit to authoritarianism. Rather, the point is that freedom, as nebulous as the term is in modern times, is not as straightforward a concept as its proponents would believe, and it's contradictory and inconsistent in many regards. This isn't to say that all things which strive for freedom should be abandoned. Rather, it's that the term itself is an inadequate standard for societies to follow and be judged by, and that therefore, the standard may be done away with in favor of more concrete or more important ones. As always, thank you for watching.